Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest, where we try to honor creators. And it could be a podcaster or an author. And today we're honoring author Charley Harrell, former BYU instructor, with his book, This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Theology. Welcome, Charley, to the program.
Thank you, Gene. Good to be on.
And let's get some background. Let's talk about the early years of Charley Harrell. Where'd you grow up and stuff like that?
I grew up in the Midwest in Indiana, small farming town community. Lived there for about 18 years till I came out to BYU. Went to school for a year and then served a mission to Mexico. And just backing up a bit, growing up in Indiana, of course, that's very strongly Protestant and Catholic.
Right. The mission field, as Mormons would call it.
Right. So we just had a small branch of the church there, at least for most of the time I lived there. And it was always a question in my mind why we had different beliefs. And the more I studied and learned about the church, I realized that, wow, we believe some very interesting things that the rest of the world doesn't know about. How special we are to have these special
knowledge.
Special knowledge, right, and insight.
We were almost like the Gnostics of the 20th century.
Exactly. That's how it felt. So coming to BYU, for me, that was like a mecca of Mormon information about the church. And
especially, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, especially the BYU library. They had every book imaginable. And so it
was like Alexander's library in Alexandria.
Almost. In Alexandria, right. They had all the special books.
The pertinent knowledge.
Right. And it's amazing how much is published. And the more I read, it just reinforced the LDS narrative, because that's all I was reading was literature that was written inside the bubble by Latter-day Saints for Latter-day Saints. And so I thought that was very informational. It helped me go on a mission and serve a mission with enthusiasm, knowing the Book of Mormon was true. And when I came back, I continued learning.
What do you think? What were your high school experiences that prepared you, or was it your Mormon experience more that prepared you to learn because the glory of God was intelligence, or what propelled you to maybe excel in college as like the seeds? What were the seeds in your formative years? Did you have a good teacher somewhere, or?
Not really. I think there were some good role models. I remember having a stake high counselor that was, he had a bunch of issues of dialogue on his shelf, and progressive. And that was really fascinating to me, that he was learning all of this additional material I didn't know about. And
the dialogue issues are almost like Mormon Apocrypha.
Right. Yeah. So that was, that gave me at least a curiosity to want to know more and dig into that kind of literature, see what it was all about and what they had to say.
And where'd you go on your mission?
To Mexico. And that was a time when there were 5 missions in Mexico and in the entire country. I served in Mexico City and the surrounding area. And now there's multiple missions just within Mexico City, from what I understand.
I think there's over 20 in Mexico.
Wow.
I asked how many were in Brazil as well. I was asking Alexa all these questions, and I think there were like 34 in Brazil.
That's huge. Of course, the baptisms there were much greater than they were in other parts of the world, as they probably still are. Except for now, I think you go to places like Africa, and it might be even more than that.
And did you achieve AP status on your mission or zone leader?
Yeah, I was a zone leader. Never got to the AP position. But
That's right. It's all near sainthood for missionaries.
yeah. So that was one of the things that struck me about the mission field is the politicking. I was
Right.
one that was I wanted to just keep my head down and just do the work. I was all about being a good missionary. And
Because you wanted to teach the gospel of Christ, but there was a business side to being a missionary, almost a salesman,
right,
sales guide.
yeah. And you could tell
motivated.
the missionaries that would kiss up to the president, and try to
there's that too, right?
make that impression. And
because that shouldn't make any difference. It should be discernment that the mission leader would be able to just produce the best, move the right people up, not because they were doing special favors.
Yeah,
president or whatever.
And it was interesting how that works. Missionary work really is a sales. I mean, that's what it's all about. But what they teach you is that no, it's all by the Spirit. So if you are righteous enough, if you pray hard enough, and you do the work, you go out there and look for the people, you'll find them. The Lord's going to bless you with baptisms, right?
And if you don't have success, what does that say about you?
You were either not worthy, you weren't praying hard enough, you need to fast more.
There you go. Do you remember how many baptisms you had?
It was somewhere around 50, I think.
50.
So more than
average, slightly.
I don't know. That was about average for the mission.
Yeah. And then, did you go do any college before going on mission? Or
I went actually to BYU. I think it was just a semester. I think I might have said a year, but it was just a semester, and then I went on a mission. One thing I was going to say, though, about some of the missionaries that got the most baptisms were not the ones who put their head down and did the work and
followed all the
rules. They were the goof-offs, the ones that just spent a lot of time socializing with the members, that didn't really have that, weren't following that.
Baptisms by charisma.
It was, yeah, it really was. And so, but it really taught me a lesson that it's really salesmanship that gets the baptisms. It's not the Spirit.
People connection. What do you call that? People skills.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And so, when you went back to BYU, did you feel that your mission discipline helped you be a better student?
Yeah. I mean, it is a good discipline. You learn a lot of things. You learn how to work hard. Now, this isn't true with every missionary, obviously. And in fact, I was amazed that some missionaries, you wonder why some missionaries are even out there. And then they come back and they're just the same goof-offs as they were during the mission.
Right. So how long, once you returned to school, did you keep a notebook in your pocket?
The daily planner. Yeah.
The daily planner thing.
Right.
Did you keep it the whole rest of the time, or did you kind of cast it aside?
No, that's something I wasn't real good at, is scheduling things.
Okay.
I just kind of did my thing.
And so, did you have a goal in mind at that time of what your education was going to be, or did you sort of explore some things?
Yeah, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And I looked in a number of areas like psychology. That was always fascinating to me. Even got into philosophy, thought about being a seminary teacher. But then I had a branch president. As a student, they had branches there at the time, and he taught in the School of Technology. And I got interested, started asking him questions about the program. And as your friend Nathan alluded, that's the kind of program that actually allows you to get a job when you graduate.
Right, right.
So that was appealing. So I thought, well, I can do
Very good career path.
yeah, I can do the abstract stuff, philosophical thinking, theology. I can do that on the side, but I need to have a paying job to get it all done. So
That's right. And what year did you graduate with your undergrad?
it was 1976. Had my first job with Ford Motor Company back in Detroit. So I worked there for 4 years. I taught institute there on the side. They had an evening institute program.
Was that volunteer?
Yeah. It was, they had an institute director at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and he recruited faculty who could teach institute at different towns, like in Lansing and Detroit. Dearborn is where I taught.
So did your contribution at Ford, like you designed the cigarette lighter in the 82 Mustang or something like that?
That's not far from it. A lot of people have the idea that, oh, you made cars. Not exactly. Oh, you made the engine. Well, not exactly. It was down to a couple of the cylinders that went into an engine block for a particular model of car that they had. So it's very focused.
Wow, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, what is it? The concept cars, artists are given clay and they start shaving off the clay block until they come up with the car shape. And then somebody says, yeah, that's what we want. And then the engineers have to go inside and all the nooks and crannies and figure out where the wires and
Right.
where the doors, hinges are going to be and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's just, and nowadays, you look at cars nowadays compared to even the late 70s, they're just all computers and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
And I remember seeing a friend working on like a car from the 50s, and he was small, but he could like sit inside the engine area and work on, the spark plugs or the heads or the carburetor and stuff like that. And now like everything's like engineered to be like real, almost like no lost space.
Right.
Like.
Very compact, all modular.
And so that's a lot like the Book of Mormon. No, I'm just kidding.
Right.
So after Ford, where'd you go?
Then I got a job. This was in an economic downturn in the late 70s, early 80s. And then I came to Salt Lake City and worked in Salt Lake City for a company called Eaton Kenway, making automated material handling systems. So got into robotics and automated storage and retrieval systems, things it was interesting.
So lots of
working
switches and activators. What do you call those? Where something like does one job in the whole system. I'm trying to think of what the word is. I can't remember, but anyway. So then and what'd you do? And what was the career path from there to get back to BYU as a professor?
So I had started working on a master's degree at the University of Michigan in industrial engineering. And when I got to Salt Lake, I found out that the U had a master's program in industrial engineering as well. So I completed my master's degree there, and BYU was desperate for faculty members. Otherwise, they wouldn't have hired me in that particular area. So they hired me with just a master's degree, and they were willing to allow me to pursue a PhD while I was teaching at BYU.
like some sort of concurrent program.
Yeah, it was concurrent to an extent, but I had to actually take a leave of absence for a couple of years. And I
Okay.
got my PhD at the Technical University of Denmark. They were one of the few countries in the world that offered a PhD specifically in manufacturing engineering.
Wow. So what were the top manufacturing companies in Denmark? Do you remember at the time?
Um,
I mean, was that like a selling point that we produce engineers that have gone to done these things in the Netherlands, or I mean, Europe or whatever?
yeah. Denmark didn't have large engineering firms. They were just more part of the European, economy. So they had, I can't remember if Airbus was around at that time. Probably not. This was clear back in the early to mid '80s.
They were providing engineers for IKEA, though.
Right. For IKEA to develop this kit of parts to sell
That's right.
that the consumer.
So then, what was your first job as a master's degree instructor? Did you teach like introduction to
Teaching at BYU? I
Yeah.
taught courses in process planning, in systems design. So my interest was more in the systems level. How do you integrate all of the different pieces into an entire production facility?
Wow.
So I actually developed some simulation software as part of my PhD degree. And this is computer modeling, basically. So you could, it was software that allowed an engineer to lay out a facility graphically on the screen and give it operating characteristics for each of the components, and then push a button to say simulate, and it would actually go through the production process of what would happen in a real live production situation. So the purpose of that is to identify bottlenecks, deployment of resources, just how well things would work in a system. What would happen, for example, if you had an assembly line where each individual operator is dedicated to a specific operation versus allow an operator to do multiple different tasks? Of course, that's that whole idea of trying to give them a little more meaning in their job so that it doesn't lead to
boredom, burnout.
Worker alienation, burnout, that type of thing.
So you didn't want to have people stuck in screwing the caps of the toothpaste tubes as their only job.
That's right. You had to give some variety.
I think I learned that job on Charley and the Chocolate Factory. In that one of his dad did that, I think, at the factory.
Right. Or you can go back to the I Love Lucy.
Oh yeah, when she's doing the conveyor belt job.
Conveyor belt, right. So what I developed, it could model conveyor systems, automatic guided vehicle systems.
And all those things are why we have DHL or, moving, mail across the globe, systems for, logistics.
Exactly.
All kinds of areas. So anyway, I could talk a lot longer on that as well. But at some point, you started formulating on the side thoughts about church history.
Right.
When did that come about?
So after reading just about every church book there was in the BYU library and learning, what all the prophets had taught about everything, I had gone through the history of the church, comprehensive history of the church, Journal of Discourses, Millennial Star, trying to see what the prophets taught about everything, because I had the impression and the belief that all you need to do to learn truth is find out what the prophets have taught on different topics. And the more I got into it, though, I realized, wow, here's Brigham Young teaching this, John Taylor's teaching something else. How do you reconcile that? And it was pretty puzzling to me. And then I started getting into, I think, some dialogue articles. There was a good book put out by, I think it was Signature Books, Line Upon Line, edited by Gary Bergera, on different doctrinal topics and how they evolved. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Let's take all these, because I had made photocopies and everything of all these different teachings.
And you had a file system of all the subjects
Oh,
that you
exactly. Oh, yeah.
were putting in order.
Right. This was before, it was all computerized, but
Did you have a file cabinet dedicated to your Mormon stories?
I did. So I had file after file on different doctrinal topics. And so I got them out and I started laying them out chronologically. And that for me was the huge revelation, to see that these things evolved over time. And while I was teaching at BYU, I got fascinated with this one doctrine of preexistence that was fairly uniquely LDS, right? Nobody has quite the same kind of a belief in a preexistence. Maybe there's a slight inkling about preexistence that some churches may have, but most people just believe in the creationism, that God created all things and life begins here on earth. And looking at that and the teachings so I narrowed it down just to the span of the first 15 years of the church. Joseph Smith's teachings from the Book of Mormon until till 1845. So that's how many years? 15 years of the church.
So let's see, he started translating the Book of Mormon in like 1827.
Yeah, around then, 23, he started, when he first
visions
of Moroni, and then started translating.
And
it was published in March of 1830.
And then the Book of Commandments included revelations that Joseph Smith had received.
That's right. And he began the Book of Moses. The Pearl of Great Price started in the summer of 1830.
Right. Started to translate the Bible.
Exactly.
Joseph Smith's translation project, whatever they called it at the time.
Right. It was called the Translation Project, even though it wasn't really a translation.
Right. Because was there like a committee of members that worked with him, or was it just him and some scribe?
He had scribes.
Right.
Sidney Rigdon, Oliver Cowdery, scribes that worked with him. But
so your thoughts, the thoughts on the pre-existence. When did the pre-existence come about first in Mormonism from Joseph Smith?
So it first became clear in the Book of Moses in 1830, in about June of 1830, the same time Joseph Smith was receiving some revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, early revelations, and it made allusions to the spiritual creation. Interestingly, the Book of Mormon doesn't talk about preexistence. It talks about everything being created and life starting here on earth, and that Christ was the creator of both the spirit and the body, our bodies.
And you make sure part of your study included like the 1830 version of the Book of Mormon, or 1835, where it had Joseph Smith's corrections, or whatever version that was, 35 or 37, I can't remember.
Right. So instead of calling Jesus the Father, it was Jesus is the Son of God, or
right, instead of Jesus God, or Mary the mother of God, Mary the mother of the Son of God.
Right. So those kinds of things obviously get you thinking, what's going on here? Is that just a correction, an oversight that he needed to correct, or was that deliberate?
Printer's error.
Yes, right. But you see, so many of those kinds of things. For example, initially, Joseph Smith tended to remove references to a plurality of gods from the scriptures. The Book of Mormon, where it would say things that or cite Old Testament passages that did refer to gods, Joseph Smith would make it singular as just God. And then in the Book of Moses, also that plurality was removed so that it had just God creating. And then it was later he came back and started saying, no, it should have been gods all the way through, and changed it back.
So that was a quick sort of a change back then.
Yes.
And did any of your research that you were acquiring at the time or later include like any other religious philosophers who had considered a pre-existence at all? Like Mormon parallels?
Yes.
They would call them.
Yeah. And so what I was interested in with the pre-existence is seeing how Joseph Smith's contemporaries viewed the same biblical teachings. And it was surprising to discover that in Joseph Smith's area, and too often what I found LDS writers saying is that the doctrine of pre-existence was so innovative. It was so unique. Nobody had thought about that. It was a doctrine that had been completely lost from the earth.
I even thought that the school of the prophets was the only time it had ever existed. And then I find out that most of the colleges that were formed in the early colonial America that were formed by religious institutions had a school of the prophets, because there also was, in a way, different meaning for prophet. It could just meant instructor, right? A prophet could be a teacher or something like that. And so this teaching school would have the school of the prophets, and they didn't think that they were teaching people how to have visions or anything like that. It was just, but they still existed. The names of schools of prophets existed in the early Americas.
That's right. Yeah. The church organization, of teachers, deacons, and so forth, and their duties, it was almost lifted directly from the Methodist discipline book of the time. Same verbiage and everything.
Did you also tie some of those sort of Mormonisms, we'll call that, due to who was converting, like Sidney Rigdon or other people as they joined the church would sort of change?
Right. Yeah. It would reflect the thinking, the mind of, say, Sidney Rigdon. His is very obvious when he joined the church came to Joseph Smith in late 1830, I believe it was. And almost immediately you saw the impact of his thinking in a lot of the revelations, the whole idea of a bishop's storehouse, having all things in common. And the priesthood was a big one. So going back to pre-existence, what I discovered is that all of the ideas that were taught in early Mormonism about the pre-existence had precedence in the contemporary teachings of Joseph Smith, of his day. So from the idea of a spiritual creation, and by the way, that's the initial teaching on pre-existence was simply that God created the spirits of everybody. It wasn't this idea of eternally existing intelligence or intelligences. That came later. There was a clear
with Abraham stuff.
Right. So what I discovered was that there were at least 4 different phases of teaching of pre-existence within those first 15 years of the church, from no kind of a spirit creation in the Book of Mormon to a spirit creation in the Book of Moses, early Revelations. And then there started to get even an idea of what contemporaries called emanation. And this is an idea that goes clear back into the Stoics and early Christianity, even, where we emanated from God. And so you look at D&C 93, for example, that's such distinctive language there, that man was in the beginning with God as intelligence, or that same light of truth. And it's like we didn't exist as intelligences then, but it was just God's intelligence, and a part of that, or a portion of that, became independent in a sphere in which God had placed it. That's how early Latter-day Saints understood section 93 initially. And then with, like you say, the book of Abraham, the later teachings of Joseph Smith on the eternal existence of intelligences as an intelligence became very predominant. And surprisingly, there is no recorded teaching in the life of during the lifetime of Joseph Smith where spirit birth was taught, or at least the idea that we were once spirit offspring of heavenly parents.
That is interesting. So at this time, did the idea of a book come to your mind, or just a paper on the subject?
Yeah. So at that time, I actually published a paper for BYU Studies on the development of the doctrine of preexistence in early Mormon thought, specifically from 1830 to 1845. And in doing that, and of course, in the process of even doing the research for that, I came across all these other doctrines, baptism for the dead, atonement theory, all these other things that had contemporary teachings during Joseph Smith's lifetime. And they were very similar to what I was reading in the Book of Mormon. Obviously, anybody who reads early 19th century evangelical discourses and then opens the Book of Mormon, it's like it's lifted right from the sermon culture at the time.
Right. And so you submit to be published, right? They have to approve it.
The BYU Studies article.
BYU Studies.
That was tricky. So it went to Jeffrey Holland was the president at the time. He actually sent it up the line even further to Neil A. Maxwell to get approval to print it.
So this is sort of the early 80s?
Yeah, this was the early to mid 80s. And it was approved. I framed the language such that this wasn't Joseph Smith pulling these things just from his culture, but that as he was getting additional light and knowledge, he was filling in with what his cultural surrounding was teaching, right?
So line upon line with mortar from the culture.
There you go. Yeah. Or pulling in lines, filling in gaps,
Filling in gaps.
From the culture. And that's an easy concept to sell to a faithful.
Because those could just be space holders until further light and knowledge come.
Exactly. But then when you realize the way the teachings were framed, thus saith the Lord, and all these kinds of things, and the fact that these later teachings it wasn't just adding to or expanding, but they were contradicting earlier teachings. The earlier teaching was that God simply created these spirits. And then you have a later teaching in the book of Abraham that intelligences are eternal. They're not created.
So is it part of the BYU Studies publishing a paper program that somebody would then do a critique of your work? Do you remember?
Yeah, I'm trying to think what the reviews were of that article.
Oh, right, a review.
But there
Somebody
were reviews prior to publication, so I got lots
Oh,
of feedback
right.
from different people.
Okay.
But
Did it give you a chance to change some things in your paper?
oh yeah, yeah, and the changes were good for the most part, and
like a refinement.
yeah, so they allowed me to refine it and to frame it in such a way. So much of Mormon teachings, or if somebody wants to go off and publish something and not get in trouble with the church, so much of it comes down to just how they say it, right? The church is more concerned about loyalty and a show of support than they are with the exact way that something is taught. Or I shouldn't say the way. They're concerned about the way. They're not so concerned about content as they are about delivery.
Okay. So it's your attitude.
Yes, right.
They want you to have the obedient attitude.
Exactly.
And so did you present that anywhere live, or when was the first time you presented something to an audience of your studies?
Wow.
And it doesn't have to be the first one. It could be.
Yeah. I presented in small groups. I remember I even presented to faculty at BYU in our program because they were aware that I had a publication in BYU studies, which was unusual for somebody who's in engineering and technology. But most of the presentations came after publishing the book. So with publishing the paper, though, as I mentioned, I got interested in other doctrines. And I thought, wow, has anybody really explored the development of all the other doctrines of Mormonism to see how they shifted over time?
Right. And did this paper sort of become a chapter in your book?
It did. Paper? Yeah. So I made a few changes to it, included some other concepts. I was also interested in the book in going back to biblical times to see how doctrines were understood anciently in the Old Testament, New Testament, early 19th century, in Joseph Smith's environment, and then walking through Mormonism, how Mormonism kind of absorbed these things from the environment and then built upon those throughout Joseph Smith's lifetime, certainly, and then even on to the present day.
So at that time, I mean, I guess you're getting also some positive feedback, right? It's like, oh, this is pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's sort of like Bushman's rough stone rolling. For some people, that's a
deal breaker.
Promoter, yeah. But for others, it's a shelf breaker. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so let's see. What about, what year did you start to think you're making a book after so many papers or whatever that you publish or research that you're doing?
So I had written a couple articles for Studies in Scripture. It's a volume that was an anthology published by BYU, the religion department. Had also been involved in publishing an article, two articles for the Encyclopedia of Mormonism.
Are these still available online if people did the research?
Right. Oh, yeah.
So I'll actually try to provide some links to some of the things that we were talking about in the description, and I'll try to find it. If I can't, I'll ask you to find them and send me the links.
Okay.
I'll add it to it.
Good.
And so about when? In the mid 90s or?
So I would say by the end of the 80s, as I mentioned, I published this article in BYU Studies. It finally published in 88. I had worked on it, though, submitted it. It took several years for it to finally get published. But so during that time, I was continuing to collect additional materials on other doctrines. and starting to get in my mind the idea of doing either individual papers or an entire volume on the different major doctrines of Mormonism and how they evolved over time. So by 1990, I had a clear plan to publish a book.
It's part of your idea to publish a book is like you're looking for these doctrinal development stories, and you're not seeing one book.
Right. As I
So
mentioned,
you can get a little here and a little there, but it's
Yeah,
not in one receptacle.
exactly, and that's what I wanted to do. So the book is a real sleeper. If you pick it up and start reading it, it's
Cure
almost
for insomnia.
right, exactly. It's more like an encyclopedia or like reading a dictionary than it is reading, a novel. I don't get into a lot of
You're not
just
known for your prose.
exactly. It's more just here was the teaching then, here's how it was taught next, and so on.
Almost like how an engineer would write a book.
Yes, a lot like that. I had written manuals, technical manuals, and it was a lot more like that.
And what the heck? Why mess with that pattern, right?
Right. Let's not get into the verbosity. Let's just go right for the jugular.
That's right. Just the facts, ma'am.
Right. Get to the point. So I've never been a novel reader, for example.
There you go.
Just not my thing. But the other thing is I tried to compact so much into one volume. As I mentioned, I took every doctrine and traced it from biblical times through 19th century era, and then early Mormonism, later Mormonism. And any one of the doctrines could have filled an entire book.
So the vast majority of your work is like making this turn into this.
It really was. I had to cut it back almost in half before it was published because they kept saying it was just too long. It's got to be shorter. And
did they say something like, Charley, there's only so many trees in the world.
Save the forest. Save
the forest.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I took a lot of I had summaries at the end of each chapter and that were a little longer and tried to give a little more discussion, but I ended up having to take those out because it just added too much to the length.
So do those still exist somewhere, like on a CD or?
Probably somewhere. I'd have to dig them up.
So it would take a public outcry for you to like do just like, what was it? I can't remember if it was D. Michael Quinn or somebody else did a second volume just for like backup documentation. Somebody did that. I can't remember recently. No, In Sacred Loneliness, I think.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, Todd Compton, I think,
recently published the backup documentation.
Wow. Now, would that be more readable than the original, or is it just a lot of?
I think you should tell people, hey, if you want to enjoy my book, start with Todd Compton's backup information book, and then read my book, and you'll be excited with what a good writer I am.
Right. I'll have to look at that.
Yeah. So in the early 2000s, you pretty much have all your chapters outlined.
Yeah. In fact, I went to Greg Koford in early 2000, and he liked the book. He thought that it needed to be pared down a little bit, turned it over to one of his editors, who was Lloyd Erickson at the time.
Now, was that Koford Books at the time or Seagull Books? Or
it was Koford Books.
So it was Koford Books. Okay.
And we went through about a 2-year editing process. So it was virtually ready to be published in 2005. And I thought, in full disclosure, I should let the BYU administration know that I'm publishing this book. I didn't want to they've been fair to me. I wanted to be fair to them and let them know what I'm publishing.
You don't want to blindside them,
Right.
but you're
Yeah.
not keeping it from them in fear of your job yet.
That's right.
You're just thinking, I'm doing this side project and it's about to come out. I'll tell them, let them know.
Yeah. Yeah. Just be prepared. I mean, this has come out. You
Full
may
disclosure and informed consent, although you're not really looking for their consent.
Right.
Necessarily.
Right. It was more just to advise them that this is what I'm planning to do.
And so it goes through a bit of a review process there then?
Yeah, I got called in and they wanted to talk to me. It was the John Tanner at the time, and the academic vice president. I can't remember his name at the moment, but so we had a long discussion, and they said, I sent them just the first couple chapters, just so they can get an idea of what this is going to be about. And they said, you need to go talk to the religion department,
Right. So you're just talking to your department. Yes.
I haven't talked to my department yet. I'm talking about the university senior administration.
So you presented to the senior administration people, the people that are under the president, sort of.
Right.
And they say this is sort of like something that needs to be put to the specialists. The religious department will know more about whether these things you're saying is something that should be published.
That's right. And what you've written is a little bit disturbing, so it's probably not accurate. It's certainly not orthodox. Go see the religion department and have them read it, and they can kind of set you on the right path.
This is sort of like a pre-academic council of love.
Right. Just about that. But I had read everything the BYU religion department faculty had written. I knew what their views were on different things. I knew exactly what they would say about the different things I was writing. And I was writing the book to push back against this
narration.
Yeah, this in-group think on Mormon theology. Right.
Right. And so you go to the religious department.
Yeah, I went and talked to the dean at the time. It was Terry Ball. And he thought, we can take a look at this for you and correct it. And he said, this sounds a lot like what the biblical scholars teach. This is not Mormon. The whole thinking and the mentality in Mormon publication was, if you want to know what the interpretation of Scripture is or what the true doctrine of something is, you have to be able to cite a
modern prophet.
Yeah. And that's how the books were written.
That's the litmus test.
Yeah. It would cite a passage of Scripture. Here's what Joseph F. Smith or Brigham Young said about it. So that's how we're to understand it. And it is so...
It's a narrow boundary.
Closed, yeah. Very narrow. And so the dean started telling me how disappointed he was with, for example, the Society of Biblical Literature, because it was so difficult for BYU faculty to get anything published there. Because, for obvious reasons, they don't do true scholarship. They were doing apologetics. And it's just a different thing. And I just
really the antithesis of what a university is supposed to be.
Exactly. But that whole mindset has been so ingrained in our culture, in the institution of BYU, that was hard to get out of. And I will say that BYU they've gone light years ahead of that over the last 10
Decade.
years. Yeah.
Mhm.
They have some very capable faculty there. They allow serious scholarship to be pursued.
So when the dean of the religious studies area is reading this, Rough Stone Rolling had already been out for a couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
3 or 4 years maybe.
Yeah.
And did you say, well, look, this is scholarship? And he's not saying exactly what we all learned in Sunday school.
Yeah. Yeah. That.
And did they say, well, he got published by Illinois Press or something like that?
Yeah. So that is a little different because of the publisher, but also it was predominantly history. History bothers some people, and we all know history can be messy, that humans create history. I mean, it's a human thing, but the doctrines, the theology was something different. I mean, this gets at the core truth claims of the church. And so if you're going to challenge the church teachings, that puts you on the hot seat.
And in a way, you're using a word in your title that is really anathema to Mormon studies, and that's theology. We don't have theology. We only have doctrine. We only have what prophets teach. There's no study of God from a scholarly position or study of things like
Right.
that.
Right. We don't really do theology. We study doctrine.
There are Christian theologians and Catholic theologians and other religion theologians. There are no Mormon theologians.
And that is astounding when you think about it. With all of the deep doctrinal thought that we have in our church, pre-existence, becoming like gods, but yet we don't have theologians like other Christian denominations do.
And in a way, that's exactly what Joseph Smith was.
Yes.
He was the first and only Mormon theologian.
Right.
Although Brigham Young twisted some things around with Adam God. That was we call it the Adam God theory now, but it's really the Adam God theology.
Yes. Yeah. So we do theology, really, but just not in any kind of traditional way that involves.
Yeah, we don't try to call it that because that's like the philosophy of men mingled with Scripture.
Yeah.
Right. It's like what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever we're doing, it's not that.
Right.
Right. And so that is interesting. So then what does the religious dean say?
He offered to have some of his faculty take a look at it. And I said thanks, but no thanks, because, again, I knew.
Oh, taking a look at it meant almost like editing.
Yes. We're
going to censor
it and point out why you're wrong and where you're wrong, because, we're going to show you things that don't line up with what the prophet's teachings are. And but the thing that I think that saved me in the book, in writing it as from a faithful perspective, so to speak, is that I wasn't criticizing the church. I wasn't even criticizing the doctrines and saying that this is true or false.
Yeah, you weren't having any conclusions.
The history. Yeah, I didn't.
You're reporting on it.
Right.
Do you say in your book anywhere that it's up to the reader to conclude things, or do you not even say that?
Oh, I do say that what my intent is in the introduction. I say that it isn't to prove or disprove the different claims. Let's see.
So were you engaging in conversations with any of the disciples of Leonard Arrington at the time? Like, did you ever talk with like Lowell Benyon or some other, or D. Michael Quinn or any of the other authors from the 90s and early 2000s about their new history, sort of?
No. I read the material. I was familiar with the individuals, but again, I was coming at this more from a doctrinal perspective than a historical perspective. Now, having said that, this is the history of doctrine, but it's not a history book. It's those people are more, hardcore historians.
Yeah, because the historians are supposed to like take the evidence and tell us what happened based on the evidence. And you were just saying, here's the evidence.
Yes. Yeah. Here's what we have. Here's the record of thought.
You weren't interpreting these things. You're just presenting it to people.
Reporting. Exactly. So from that standpoint, I wasn't a creator or innovator. I was merely a reporter. And really the impetus for this whole book was I was interested in publishing or putting together something that I wish I had in all the years I spent and thousands and thousands of hours studying Mormon doctrine and trying to make sense of it. I wish somebody had given me this kind of a framework to think about doctrine within.
And you almost might have thought, why hasn't been this compiled yet?
Exactly. That was the thought. Exactly. This is something that needs to be written. It's not, I don't see it anywhere.
Did you think, I wonder if like the reasons behind the September 6 excommunications might be why some of this stuff hasn't been coming out?
Yeah. And you can find a lot of pieces in publications like Sunstone Dialogue, right? I mean, they've been doing that for years, but nowhere was there a single source that just had it all lined up together. But yeah, it was obvious that BYU faculty would get in trouble if they tried to publish even a dialogue article along these lines.
You were teaching at BYU during the September 6th. How many members of BYU were in the September 6th? Was it like 4 or 5 of them were?
Yeah,
BYU.
I think it's 6, right?
All 6 of them were. Yeah, I have to look at the list.
I don't know. They weren't all at BYU.
Yeah.
How many were at BYU?
The majority, I think.
The majority were. Yeah. And
so you were there when that happened. Did that make you think about your own? Did you have a second thought about doing Mormon history?
Right. Yeah. When you hear about the stories, but I wasn't so concerned because I wasn't advocating for a particular ideology or social. I wasn't advocating for LGBTQ or something that
you were just excited about the discovery.
Yeah, that hey, this is just information. That's all. I'm just sharing
information. Information by itself is neither good nor bad.
Exactly.
Just information.
That was my feeling, but apparently others didn't see it that way.
So the book gets printed. You appear.
I should say, this is 2000. Go back to 2005. So finally, when it was about to be published, I approached the school administration. They got back to the dean, the dean of the college, and he called me in. And he told me point blank. So the deans of the colleges, they have
meetings.
They have control over the faculty in their colleges. And he told me, if you publish this book, you cannot stay at BYU.
And that was specific fire across the bow, not just a potential. He was saying this will happen. That
This
this
will,
is
that's,
not it could happen.
that's right. He said that. And
And
so
so
I
that
thought,
make you that
am I
held
ready
you
to
off a
leave
couple of
BYU?
years.
Yeah. So am I ready to leave BYU or not? So I sat on it for 5 more years. So that's why it wasn't published until 2010, 2011. And finally, I just got to a point where I thought, I don't care if I get ejected from BYU or dismissed.
Even having a magnum opus is worth anything.
That's right. That's right. I thought this is just too important for me. I thought it was too valuable. It's something that needs to be said and put out there. And I just went ahead and did it. And
So
interestingly, I never heard from the dean.
after publication.
Right.
Right.
So I went on teaching for another 6 years, retired, never was an issue.
So from 2005 to 2011, did you get like a call from Covered Books annually or every 6 months or every month?
Yeah, we kept in touch, and they understood that, yeah, we need to postpone and delay this. Greg Koford was very good about it. And I started back up into refining, or the final editing phase, around 2009, maybe. And at that time, it was Lavina Anderson who was the editor, and she was extremely helpful.
I've heard nothing but compliments about her.
Yeah, she was an amazing person.
And so you get to like have lunches with her and stuff like that, or
No, it was all remote. In fact, it was interesting. Her husband was the director of the Museum of Art. I think that was his title. And so I would actually take my copies of my manuscripts that I had to her husband, and he would deliver them to her. She lived in Salt Lake.
so these were still printed copies of the manuscripts,
Yes.
so that she could go through them and do edit marks and stuff like that.
So she would do that, send them back to her husband. I'd run up there and pick them up and incorporate the edits. And so we went back and forth like that for about a year.
Did she ever make a mark where you didn't like, you were thinking like, what is this mark? I've never seen this mark before.
There were a few. Yeah. She was,
Did you have to like ask everybody else or look up an edit book? Like, what did this mark means?
Right.
Like, what do these 3 dots in a comma mean?
Yes. Yeah. She taught me a few things. And there were some things that I had thought meant one thing, some little abbreviation. And she corrected me and said, no, it actually means this. So you can't use that there.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. It's like writing a book is like an English lesson.
It is. Oh, yeah.
There you go. And so you published the book. ABC Nightline invites you on. Oprah.
Oh, yeah.
Did you do any book signings at Cover Books?
I did at Benchmark Books. Koford doesn't really, he's just
Their
a publisher.
publisher, right?
Yeah. But
and did you like do readings? Would you read things?
No.
I mean, it seems pretty weird to read a technical manual as a reading somewhere.
Yeah. So not very interesting.
Did you give like a little talk about the creation of it, or did they ask you to speak very much about it at all?
Yes, I've done that on numerous podcasts.
What was the first podcast you might have been on?
I think Mormon Stories was the first one.
And that was about a dozen years ago.
Yeah.
Was it really close to publication?
Oh, it was published at that time.
Right. But it wasn't like he discovered a year later. He was right on it asking you to come on his show.
No, I think it took a year or so.
Uh-huh.
He became familiar with it, and the fact that I think he was more interested in the fact that I was a BYU faculty member, having published this.
Something like that. That'd be like Dan Vogel was a faculty member while he published The Making of a Prophet.
Yeah. It would have been a huge story, right?
I mean, even Richard Bushman wasn't a faculty member when he wrote his books or anything like that. So
That's
yeah,
right.
that was kind of unique.
Mm-hmm.
And what was your experience like on Mormon Stories back then?
It was good. It's the first time I had done an interview of that type.
So you couldn't compare it with anything?
Yeah. I think John was sensitive to the fact that I was still on the BYU faculty.
Right.
And so I think that slanted, the way that he conducted it. He didn't want to put me on the spot to say something that would embarrass BYU, say.
Sure.
Or get me fired.
Right. Like you didn't name names of all the deans that threatened you.
That's right.
That came later.
Yeah. I should say too that one of the concerns, the biggest concern, and this was a little revealing to me, the concern that the academic vice president had and the provost that I spoke with was that they did not want to get a letter from the parent of a BYU student saying, is this what my kids are getting there at BYU? They are almost more terrified of offending the parents of a student than they are.
And you think this parent is also like a major donor?
There you go. That
could be. They say parent, but they really mean this is going to mean dollars,
right?
For us.
Yeah, I'm sure that was an element in it, at least.
Yeah, because you never said, they're worried about the parent thing. They've already experienced those things, right? It's not like you ask them for a list of the names of the parents that they're afraid of.
Right. Yeah. They would probably have a specific list, though. As long as you don't offend this one.
For some reason, I have a feeling almost every Mormon would recognize the names of the children or the parents.
Yeah, they would probably have recognizable surnames. Yeah.
And so what other podcasts were you on that you thought you did like pat yourself on the back? I did a really good job on that podcast, or they asked me really good questions or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Does anything stand out?
So I think your podcast is an outstanding one, Gene. Is that what you were looking for there?
Come to think of it, no, I actually want more things to include in the description.
Oh, okay.
I want to, wherever you've been, to get like 1,000 more views and have people wonder.
Oh yeah.
Why did that happen?
Yeah.
Or at least a dozen more views.
Yeah. I did go on with Dan Witherspoon, as I mentioned a few times. He's a great interviewer.
Mormon Matters, was that the name of his?
Mormon Matters at the time. Yeah. Recently, I've been on Mormonism Live, Backyard Professor.
Greg Coford Books, I think, did.
Greg Coford, they had a podcast kind of series.
Was that because of COVID? They were doing it.
I think it was. Yeah. During
online,
COVID.
They were doing
yes,
almost like a live review, right?
Yeah.
People are asking questions in the chat.
Yeah, it was called an author podcast, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing that they did.
Yeah,
did you?
Those were good because it got a little more into the contents of the book.
I think I remember watching the first one, and the guy said that they were sold out. So, like, on one hand, why are they bringing you back on?
Yeah.
Were
See
you
if that's
surprised that they did it 9 years after publication, sort of, or however long it was?
Yeah, in a way, except for, as you mentioned, this was during the COVID thing, and they thought, how can we generate interest in our books? And these were books that had already been published. So they went, they just pulled out books that they had published within the last, say, 15 years. And
It's like, look, everybody, we're all cooped up. We're got it. We're going crazy, being trapped in our homes. Let's let's do something, right? Let's
yes,
create.
right.
And in a way, even talking about any of their prior books from a decade earlier or whatever brings attention to their current stable of authors or what's coming out
Exactly.
in the near future. They can make announcements, and so it's a good marketing thing.
Yeah, stimulated interest.
And you were still alive. Can't bring you back if you're passed on.
That's right. Let's get him now. This guy is getting old. He's going to kick the
That's
bucket.
right. We've seen him his appearances, and hurry up. The clock is ticking.
He ain't got long. So
yeah. Well, thanks, Charley, so much for being on the show. I hope I did a good job, and that someday, if somebody else interviews you, if you're still alive after I'm passed on, and they say, what good interviews were you ever on? You're going to say, Latter Daily Digest was a really good. Everybody should go look at that. That way, I'll have a legacy.
I will do that. Gene, thanks for having me on, and keep up the great work.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, this is my magnum opus. I'm a talker, not a writer.
Yep.
There you go.
You're leaving a legacy. Great.
That's right. Thanks everybody for watching. Hit the like and subscribe. Send money. Buy Charley's book from somebody else who bought it, because you can't buy it from the publisher. Maybe somebody will have notes.
Go on Amazon. You can find it.
Yeah, if you get a used book, it might be one of the deans that bought the book.
Could be. It is Kindle. It is on Kindle also. So,
and maybe they write in the margins all the places that Charley got it wrong. That would be a good book in a way to have.
That would be interesting. That's always interesting to get a book that some key figure had and see what notes they made in the margins. Yep.
Yeah, I was talking with, I don't know if you saw my episode, who was it? And they said that being who was the philosopher about mythology? So yeah, John Lundwall studied at whatever the school that who's the guy? The mythology guy. He did a PBS series when we were kids.
Yeah.
But he said he got to, at that college, he got to read the books that
Campbell?
he read. Yeah, Joseph Campbell.
Yeah.
He got to read the books that Joseph Campbell wrote in the margins, notes of philosophy books and mythology books that he was reading. And he said that was like so cool, to be able to do that.
That would be, yeah.
So anyway, thanks everybody for watching. Check out our channel for other shows. We have got some exciting things coming up, and have a great new year. Bye-bye.
Yep. So long.